The Future of Money, Governance, and the Law is hosted by the Government Blockchain Association, a worldwide community to connect, communicate, and collaborate. This show is produced by Podtex. To learn more and how to host your own show, go to www.podtex.com. Podtechs. Podtex, your partners in podcasting.
Hello, my name is Gerard Daché, and I'm the Executive Director of the Government Blockchain Association. I am thrilled today to have Chris Snook with us. He's the managing partner for the Launch House, and he's also the chairman and co-founder of Sandcastle Foundation and the World Tokenomic Forum. So I'm thrilled to have Chris with us. I want to just say a little personal story before I turn it over to Chris. But I met him at an event. He and I were both speaking, and quite frankly, the event was somewhat of a dud, right? And most of the folks on there, I didn't have a whole lot of respect for. But there was something about Chris from the time he took the stage, his energy, his passion, his depth of knowledge. It really turned the entire event around for me. And since then, we've entered into a relationship, and I have so much respect for you, Chris. I'm just thrilled to have you here. So welcome to the GBA podcast.
Well, I appreciate it, and I'm excited to reciprocate since you were kind enough to hop on a webinar that I did for Token Standard several months back. And yeah, there's no such thing as accidents, even when you feel like you're wasting time. That event, that to be left nameless, was a complete dog. But I wouldn't have met you had I not decided to stay and see it through. And so I'm always grateful for the serendipity that even bad situations yield. So yes, I'm excited, man. We got a lot to talk about, and I can't think of a better time to be talking about the topic of economic futures and government, and with someone who is leading the largest organization around governments and blockchain. So I'm honored to be here.
Wow, thanks. All right, well, listen, let's do some preliminaries. So why don't you tell the audience just a little bit about yourself, your background, how you came into the whole tokenomics thing, and then a little bit about what you guys are doing and where you're going forward. So the nice thing about you is I can just kind of set the table for you and then let it rip.
Yeah, and listen, I mean, you guys can Google me and find more than you ever wanted to know. The short version of this is in 1999, I began an entrepreneurial career at the age of 25. And I have learned all kinds of things throughout that, as you can imagine. But the relevant piece of how we got here and where I want to focus our attention today is over that now almost 20-year period since I've started, I've gotten really good at, mostly through painful experiences, losing money, losing things like that. I've got really good at seeing and making sense of the macro trends. I have not always been able to invest in or find the deal that was going to capitalize most on those trends. But I've pretty much become very good at one thing, which is connecting dots, not only for myself and our partners, but also for anyone that we communicate with. And I really want to connect dots for people today and give you guys something to think about, because I think that the time that we are in, the context that I'll lay out, and we'll get right into it, Gerard, with questions and talk about, how these things all come together. But right now, we are in a period, and I will go down and, to my deathbed saying this, and I'm convinced that I'm right in this way. The next 10 years will be what sets up the next 100-year playing field that we all live in, work in, operate in, and that's on a global scale. So we are actually in the most exciting and important time in human history that our living generations that are all around right now have ever had. And the next 10 years is when the next 100 years will be defined.
Wow. Well, that's not epic or anything like that, right? So, let's talk about, there's some news that came out this last week or two, and it's ongoing news about Bitcoin and about Facebook and Libra, and it certainly got the attention of a lot of folks at different levels. Our stakeholders tend to be government. So we got politicians, regulators, administrators, government contractors. So I'd like to ask you a couple questions from from their perspective, let's start with the politicians first,
Sure.
right? Why should they care about what's happened with in the Bitcoin cryptocurrency field, right? So, why should politicians, and not just in the United States, and not just in national, but local, state, national, international, why should they care about what's been happening?
Sure, and I appreciate that, and I think that communicating to this audience is communicating to you for the sake of your constituents, that ultimately, hopefully, you are truly committed to serve, despite all the things that we could look at about the political system in this country that may or may not be broken. We'll leave that for a different debate. The assumption is that you are in government because at some level you want to serve the broader set of humanity that is inside of your jurisdiction. And so through you, I am attempting to educate and give you the context that I see so that you can have a better framework for understanding the gravity of the decisions that you're making or not making, and a less biased view of whether or not there's an agenda here that I'm pushing because of some end game that I control, and more so just whether you do anything or not, or what you do or not, and how it will impact the health, vitality, and future of not only your region, but also the United States at large. Or if you're listening to this from one of the other chapters, what your opportunity, role, and risk may be in your country, because this is not just about the U.S., but obviously with the dollar hegemony and still being on a U.S. dollar reserve, there are things that are in play that maybe you haven't thought of. So let's just do a quick, if we can, Gerard, I'd like to just do a quick, how did we get here, right? Like, let's go back the last 10 years. We're 10 years in and change to Bitcoin being in existence, which really for the majority of people is the first time that anything that was a cryptocurrency existed. Now, there were prior versions, but it's a moot point. The only one that is scaled and the only one that anyone really needs to be concerned with now from a context standpoint is Bitcoin. So in 2009, the white paper comes out for a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. We all heard about this. And what that introduced for the first time is, as a government politician, advocate, or just constituent, up until that time, there was only really two forms of money. And I'm going to simplify this. So we're not getting into all the history of money. I'm simplifying this so we can understand the dynamics and how they have shifted. Prior to that, in 1913, we had the Federal Reserve Act, which established the fourth central bank in the United States since its history. The window prior to that, we did not have a central bank in the United States. So the Federal Reserve Act 2013 establishes the current 100-year cycle we've been in. I talked about the next 100 years. We got to understand the prior. Make sense? Yes, Gerard? Just making sure we don't lose it, because I'm going to go on a rant here.
Sorry.
No, I want to make
absolutely.
sure my mic's not cutting out, because I'm going to go on a rant here. Interrupt me as you need. But here's the thing. So
right, just to let you know, I'm putting it on mute just so there's no background noise. So if it takes me a moment to respond,
problem.
Just
yeah.
FYI.
So basically, just for context, in 1913, the Federal Reserve Act gets established. At that point, we now have two forms of money, which these two forms of money pretty much go back to the history of humanity, right? So I'll call it, without getting into a religious conversation, you can call it Mother Nature's money, you can call it God's money, you can call it the universe's money. But gold and silver, for 6, 7, 8,000, 10,000 years of recorded history, have always been what we would call God's money, or the universe's money, right? They're tried and true. They've been stable stores of value. They've been used forever. And so that's one form of money. The other form of money that has been created throughout that same historical cycle, and that in 1913 gets created, and that the Federal Reserve becomes our, essentially, our partner in this, a private entity, a consortium of bankers, a private entity that essentially gets the exclusive monopoly to print our nation's currency. And so at that point, we have what's called fiat money, the formation of it. Now, it was gold-backed in the beginning in Yak, but fast forward through all the things, it's by decree. That's what fiat means. So we have government money, US dollars, British pounds, right? Lira, all these things. These have existed for hundreds, thousands of years in different forms, fiats, if you will. And we have gold and silver, the assets, the real money that in some cases backed those currencies in different cycles. And as we all know today, do not back any of them, right? We're purely fiat now. So why is that important? Because in 2009, when Satoshi's white paper comes out and we introduce Bitcoin, we launch into a new variable that didn't look like it was going to work, wasn't even something to pay attention to until most people noticed it in 2017 during the big run of altcoins and BTC and all-time highs, which is now this third variable called the people's money. And the people's money is money that does not require a government decree because it is governed by code. It's governed by math. It is algorithmic. It is set in stone, and it is decentralized from the standpoint of the incentive given to the miners that ultimately maintain the network. Although they could collude and all those things that we aren't going to debate here, the reality is that there is no one to subpoena for Bitcoin. There is no address to subpoena for Bitcoin. And so why that matters is that you have a truly free market form of money. Now, we could debate whether or not Bitcoin's money. You've got all the old school guys saying it's not. And listen, their arguments aren't 100% wrong. They just don't get it. We'll get into the context. This is a thing. 10 years in, it's been killed 20 times, supposedly. It's still here. And regardless of how volatile it is, which we could talk about a little bit later, it is a third variable that is not going away. Because at this point, the open source nature of code and crypto and what Bitcoin did has made sure that no matter what, there will always be someone building something different or new or improving upon it. Now, it would be hard enough to deal with three forms of money. And the reason why we haven't had to really worry about it before is because for those of you who studied gold and silver and monetary history, you know that essentially 80% of all the official gold, which is the gold that we see in gold bricks and bars and coins, is owned and controlled by the central banks. So essentially, the only other form of competition for money to their fiat is owned by them. So it's not really competition. And it's ultimately the ultimate hedge for when their fiats go to zero, which all fiats historically over time have gone to zero. We could argue whether or not we think the USD will go to zero or not. That's not the point. The point is that all fiats at some point in history have gone to zero. And so when the world reorganized itself after the last 100-year cycle came to an end following World War II, and we had Bretton Woods in 1944, and the IMF basically said, hey, we will represent all the little guys. And I'm summarizing here, but again, for layman's terms, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, is a consortium of 189 countries that paid for their membership in gold. Whatever they had in gold reserves is what they bought in. And what they got for that was they got a seat at the table to decide the next world order, or back then, the New World Order. And so in 1944, we set up the Bretton Woods system in New Hampshire. And that's what we still have in today. Actually, the 75th anniversary is coming up next month. And so when we established the US dollar as the reserve currency for the world, and that's important because that's all most of us have ever known. So I'll take a breath there for context. Why this matters is because the fundamentals at play here are bigger than one crypto. They're bigger than Bitcoin. They're bigger than the United States, and they're bigger than China. They're bigger than all of it because we are fundamentally at a primordial moment that is also married to a business cycle. And we've just added now a fourth variable, which I haven't talked about. But just with those three variables, there are just with the two variables of assume that God's money and the government money are one because they control it. They own 80% of it, right? And the rest of it's in the ground or in jewelry and watches that we can't, extract at a big enough level. Assume that those two are now consolidated into one because they pretty much are. And you just add in BTC and crypto as an asset. And now you have two permutations or two variables. That means there's 400 possibilities with just those two. 400 different ways the world could order itself in the next 10 years. Add the third one in. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Can you explain what you mean by there's 400 ways that they
well,
can
if you do
themselves?
like a calculation around number of permutations, you take the G20, right? The top 20 countries that basically make all the decisions. You got the G7, you got the G20. So these basically get to make the rules, right? Here's what we're all going to agree to. You're going to get this, I'm going to get that. Tariff over here, no tariff over there, my dollar here, right? Like the G20 and the G7 basically control how all the governments of the world organize around each other. And for right now, we are the big dog, right? USA has been the big dog, and so we've dictated. And people don't like that, obviously, because, other people think maybe they should dictate. We've not done everything, always in a way that is shown that we deserve to dictate. Leave it at that. In other people's minds, forget what we think. That's how we show up. And so when you have 20 countries with one kind of decision to make, one variable, let's just say fiat or government, they get to pick one person to lead. Well, there's only 20 answers, right? You can say, which one of us 20 is it going to be? When you've got two variables, which is not only a fiat, but now a currency that you can't control and none of you can control, but that's out in the wild, there's 400 permutations, which means how you organize and legislate, you now have 400 different ways you could order that. And every country might not see it eye to eye, because what they realize is that if one country bans it, that's their opportunity to go have talent migrate to their country. And we saw this in 2017 just with the lack of regulation and guidance that the US had and other major countries had around altcoins and cryptos and ICOs. What did we see? We saw people setting up companies in countries no one had ever heard of before, because those countries said, we'll give you some clarity. And that wasn't sustainable. But what it showed was that all of a sudden talent, which has been freed by mobility and all these other technological advances that had nothing to do with this, is now going to where they're supported. And at a small scale, that's just a diversion, and it's a distraction, and it takes focus away from the innovation engine of the countries that actually say they want and need to lead and continue, because now your best and brightest are spending all their energy trying to figure out where they can get some certainty and avoid tail risk. Sure, everyone wants to bunch it up and say they're trying to avoid taxes and criminalization. The majority are not. The majority are just trying to build something that they see as a way to change the future in a more positive way, and they're trying to figure out where they can build it and not have tail risk. So that's one thing. The third variable adds 8,000 permutations, because now we're getting into combinations of 20 times 3 times however many ways that can order itself. And that means there's 8,000. So the complexity of it, just by adding the third variable, is huge. And why we've got a third variable now is Libra. Libra is not about Facebook and Libra. It's about what just entered the wild, which if you saw Andreas Antonopoulos' talk on this the day after it came out, it was great. And he talks about this. We now have a corporate money. And that's different than stock. That's different than anything's ever existed. We now have a white paper out in the wild that was well thought out enough to attract 27 different partners that all are big corporates, and say, we're going to create a consortium. We're going to create a system where there is a currency that essentially we invent, right? That's governed by all of us, but that we invent, not a government, that is used for payments at a large scale, because 2.5 billion users in Facebook was their starting point. Now, why that matters is because it doesn't matter whether the legislation gets shut down or not on Facebook. There's a country that will let them do it. And if not them, China is already working on it, because it's an end run against the US dollar hegemony that governs the world. It's a head run against SWIFT, which they've all been working on for the last decade. So this is Napster. It doesn't matter if Libra becomes Napster and doesn't exist. MP3s streaming is out of the bag in the currency world. And for the first time in the last 100 years, there's a free market. And it's a scary time for governments, and especially government leaders, because they don't really even understand the game that's being played. And to convince yourself that you can stop it ignores macro data that we'll talk about in a second here. And then we'll talk about maybe some opportunities where the US and other countries can be thinking about it more proactively. But I'll take a break.
Sure. So Chris, I want to talk about a couple of things, right? I want to cover what the risks to governments are, right, and then also what the responses ought to be, right? And so from a risk standpoint, and we've got again different companies, different countries represented, and different levels of government. But let's start with the U.S. government. What's the problem for national U.S. national leaders or any national leader that has a fiat currency? What's the problem as it relates to the management of debt, right? What's the problem with relationship to economic power and also national competitiveness?
Yeah, well, I think again, when you say what's the problem, most countries see it as an opportunity, not a problem. The U.S. sees it as a problem.
Well, I definitely want to talk about the opportunity.
No, I'm saying that I'll answer it as a problem, but that's a very U.S. centric question, and it's rightfully one because right now, how many tons of gold, according to the reported gold, does the U.S. control? 8,000. The next closest is Germany with right over 3,000. The IMF collectively 2,800. China's only reporting 1,800, but rumors have it that they're closer to 5,000 because they stopped reporting years ago. The reality is that when you think about economic power, the risk is losing it if you're the U.S. Now, the risk for the world, maybe.
Wait, before you go on, can you define what that means, right? What does it mean to, why does the advancement of cryptocurrencies, and everybody says that it does, but I want to just sort of articulate it. What specifically is the risk in terms of losing economic power? What does that mean?
Well, when you everything that has been, we have exported our inflation. So I'll back up a little bit. The world that we know of, economic growth that we've seen over the last 20 years specifically. Okay, so I'll do this back up a little bit, and then this will come up later. In 1980, just under 40 years ago, so let's just round up. Let's say it's almost 2020 because we're halfway there. We're almost there. In 1980, the Dow was closed December 31st, 1980. It closed at 972. I don't know what it is today. I haven't looked. Somewhere last week, it hit an all-time high of 26,656. When you look at just post-08, the ramp in the Dow and the economic growth and the valuation of this bubble, which is an everything bubble, but just the stock market, it's up and to the right. And that growth has been quote unquote prosperity, right? So we've had this unprecedented period of prosperity. And yet, summarizing it, that prosperity has really only benefited the top half of 1%. 60% of the world's population today in this country and also in other parts of the world is actually living worse than a generation before when it comes to day-to-day, what they can afford, what they can experience, things like that, right? Because it's just the basis. You used to have disparity. You used to be able to go places if you were the rich country and you could get a deal. But if you go to anywhere worth living, I lived in Tallinn, Estonia, which is a gorgeous place, beautiful country, beautiful people, cold as hell, but beautiful. I went there last year, and you know what? A place you want to live in a neighborhood you want to live is on parity with a place you want to live in a neighborhood you want to live here from a cost standpoint, meaning $300,000 to $500,000 in U.S. equivalent to live in a condo or a townhouse that's nice. Now, that doesn't make sense unless you understand what's happened over the last years with the way we've done things. We have exported our inflation that should have happened here by essentially pushing out all of our product across the world and then telling people they can only pay us in their debt service or in their remuneration in US dollars. So by flooding the world with US dollars, which we've had the right to do based on the last agreement, what we've actually done is we've exported our inflation to other people. And by law, by decree, the system is currently set up where you have to pay back our debt in our dollars. You can't pay it back in other forms. So when we went off the gold standard and everything else, it bolstered the dollar because we said the only way to pay it back is in our currency. Why does that matter? Why is China doing Belt and Road, right, and all this stuff? They're doing a similar thing in the markets they're investing in, and it could hurt them in the short run. They're getting a lot of defaults, but essentially, when you can't pay me back, now you have to give me something else. So Sri Lanka, they couldn't pay them back. So what they do? Well, now they own that port. So geopolitically, there's all these mechanisms that we've done, and now the rest of the world is also doing, China specifically, where the risk is that you literally are creating a world where you are creating nationalized and populism at scale. And you're creating walls again. We're going back to a world where we could potentially have multiple different economies, but not in a way, not necessarily in a way that's good or doesn't retract a little bit. But right now, with the U.S. dollar being the only standard by which the world economy runs, you have the risk of when that's gone, everything that we've been doing here changes. Because if all of a sudden there's another way to pay people back or not pay us at all, the macro of how we've organized our future roadmap as far as economic growth is based on staying in the top spot. The rest of the world is going, I think I'm getting to the point where maybe I could be in the top spot, specifically China or other countries.
So Chris, I want to shift over, sort of just pivot a little bit over to the debt, right? So the U.S. government, they spend more money than they bring in. So as a result, they do fractional reserve lending, right? What's the forecast if crypto? So if you think about, cryptocurrency basically didn't exist about 10 years ago, right? And now there's hundreds of billions of dollars in transactions happening, right? If that kind of scale and pace continues to grow and transactions start to happen in these alternative forms of currency, what does that do to the government's ability to spend more than they bring in, which is a political problem, and B, sort of manage the debt, right? If the demand for dollars drops, how does that all play out in how the U.S. government manages debt and spends on government programs?
So it's a multifaceted question, but let me correct a couple things, if I may, about money and debt in large. Most people do not realize, maybe they do conceptually, but they haven't internalized it. Debt is money in today's world. The only form of money that is not debt, we already talked about, which is silver and gold. And I'm leaving crypto out of it because I'm not going to get into a religious debate over whether or not BTC is money or not yet, because that debate's, look, time will prove that out. Okay, so my opinions I'll leave. The only form of, if you're going to look back and say, what is money? What's a store of value, a unit account, and all those things, and you can be certain of it, is silver and gold. Silver's been manipulated. Gold is owned by the central banks. So the only form of currency / money that we have is the US dollar and all the other fiats that have managed to somehow be somewhat stable, right? But those are more currencies. Ultimately, the only money we have is US dollars because that's the only money the world will take everywhere for now. And that is not money. That is debt, because the very nature of how it's created is the Federal Reserve Act made the U.S. customer, the U.S. population at its time and forever in perpetuity, the collateral by which it prints and creates money. So it makes money out of thin air. It buys U.S. Treasury. Essentially, there's a debt swap. We're collateralized as taxpayers, which is the reason why we need the IRS. We didn't need the IRS before the Federal Reserve because you didn't need to collateralize taxpayers, right? So everything that's out there is debt. If we were to pay off the national debt, we would have no money in the system. So it's not a matter of do we have too much debt or not enough debt. It's a fact of, yes, we have too much debt right now because what's happened is we're printing the debt at such a rate that it's compounding so fast that even though all money is debt, the debt service on our money is now the majority of our budgetary spend and going to continue to grow just on inertia alone. And that means other services and other things that are vital, whether it be healthcare, whether it be national parks, whether it be military, whether it be all these things, will have to continue, like in order to continue them in existence, Medicare, Medicaid, all these things, there's a smaller and smaller percentage of our national budget that can go to them because it's going to the debt service on the very supply of the thing that it is used to pay for it all. And so that means we can either continue to just print more or we can deflate. The problem is after '08, we didn't fix anything with the banks. We just backstopped them all with the Federal Reserve. And then we made the U.S. bond, basically the U.S. Treasury became money. The U.S. debt became the only form of actual money that the world would take in 2008. And so the everything bubble that Graham Summers wrote about is saying that every asset class is now in a bubble because 1% deflation at today's rate would crash the economy 10 to 20x what we felt in '08. In '08, we saw a 3% deflation at those numbers, and we've added $8 trillion in debt to it. So why am I saying all this? Not to scare people, just to educate you that money is debt in the current environment. The only form of money that is not debt is gold and silver, but you can't own all the gold as an individual because the only thing you can buy is a couple bricks here and there, or a couple ounces here and there from your local pawn dealer at spot plus whatever. The majority of the gold is owned by the country, so that when this system finally cracks on the weight of itself, the countries, the top 7, 8 countries that control the most gold are going to sit down. The IMF's going to represent the rest, and they're going to go, how are we going to reorganize this thing so that the world can keep moving? And that's what's going to happen. It's happened before.
So what happens, Chris? What happens when people start using alternative forms of payment? What does that do to the
well, it's not so much
currency?
what it does to the fiat currency, right? Because I can't say that with any certainty. But what's interesting about it is that it's a true free market. And the thing that people will say is why crypto's a scam or a fraud or this is because there is no control. It's a free market thing. The market either likes altcoin A, B, or C, or D and sees value in it and transacting in it, or it doesn't. And it can be flighty, right? It could change its mind. And if the market changes its mind, then that goes to zero. Like true free market, it's risky, right? Because you could be a hero one day, you could be gone tomorrow because someone else comes out with something that's better or just gets faster adoption. But at least it's a free market and it recovers quicker. When you have corrections there, they recover quicker. Like Noriel, who's the economist that loves beating up Bitcoin, he posted today on Twitter that 30% down in a day, blah blah blah. He was jacking it at BTC because it went from 13 to 9, and now it's back to around 10 or whatever. It's lumpy, right? And he loves beating up Bitcoin. And I just tweeted back to him. I said, when a ship goes over the ocean, when the horizon in an ocean, is it no longer there? Right? Because just because you can't see it,
Right.
did it disappear? Does it no longer have any value? Right? So the point isn't whether or not BTC is going to make it or not. The point is just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not there. And the thing that he can't see and that other people like him can't see ties back to generational dynamics, right? So think about boomers, people that are 65 years old today. 40 years ago in 1980, they were 25. So think about a 23 to 25-year-old in 1980, and then let's take a 23 to 25-year-old today. There are 65 million people in the United States in Gen Z, which is 23 to 25-year-olds. You add in millennials to that, it's double, right? You add in my generation, Gen X, it adds another 30 or 40 million. So forget it. 40% of all consumption in the year 2020, 6 months from now, we start 2020. 40% of all the consumption in the United States will be by people in Generation Z. Why does that matter? 69% and change of the U.S. global GDP, or whatever it is, 16 trillion, whatever we do right now today in GDP, 69% of that is consumption. 40% of that consumption will be by 23 to 25-year-olds in the year 2020. Why does that matter? Because if they don't buy stuff, or whatever they don't buy, or whatever they use or don't use to buy it, is literally driving the lifeblood of our U.S. economy. Period. End of story. Now,
And Chris, I heard recently that whenever the price of BTC or the cryptocurrencies go up, right, there's a huge increase in the number of wallet downloads. And I think I heard that 30 to 40% of college students today have
and let me tell you why, and they don't know why.
Right.
They don't consciously know why. But if a 23 to 25-year-old is listening to this right now, you're going to be more clear on why you are attracted to crypto. And here's why. The same reason why boomers were attracted to things in 1980. In 1980, the interest rate, the Fed funds rate, was 13.35. The bank rates, meaning what people lent out on average, was 15.32% in 1980. 15%. So why does that matter? Because if I'm a 23-year-old to 25-year-old in 1980, and I'm conscious enough to think about starting a family or saving or getting going, right? I'm an adult now. Then I could save money because the banks were actually giving me a big interest rate. The bond curve was up and to the right. So it meant that there was a long-term upsloped curve saying, hey, economic expansion is in your future. So you had a bond curve that was heading in the right direction. Interest rates were high, which meant prices of homes and things like that were low because it wasn't a store of value. It wasn't somewhere where you're going to go get rich, right? So the average price of a home indexed for today's money was $130K. It was $47.2 thousand, according to Money or whatever site I picked that from. $47.2K was the average price of a home in 1980 across the country, which index for today would mean $130K. The average salary was $12K. Index for today's money would be $36.7 thousand a year salary. So middle class existed is the point. Dow was at 972. Again, you could invest in stocks because you could afford to buy them. And 20 years from now, they were likely going to be more expensive. They were priced at a value, right? The Dow Jones was under 1,000 total. So you had all this opportunity, which meant people did stock market stuff. People did those things. Pensions still kind of existed. When the ERISA Act got passed and said now it's defined contribution versus defined benefit, people were forced to invest in the stock market, but that was okay because the stock market was still cheap, right? Now let's talk about today. Today, interest rates were at zero for the last 7 out of 10 years. They are creeping up to 2.45% Fed funds rate as the target by the end of this year coming into 2020. And now we've already seen, we went up a couple basis points and then the Fed said, well, now, and then, Trump and everybody's putting it on. We're going to cut them again because we want to keep the economy pushing. Again, the target rate, according to Bloomberg, is 2.45% Fed funds rate. So you can't save because your bank savings account, your CD account's under a percentage point, or maybe it's 1.5, but only on the first 5 or 10, 15 grand to get you in the door to that bank to open up an account. Meaning there's no point in saving in a bank, right? So there's nothing for a millennial, for a Gen Z, for a Gen X, for even a boomer right now to justify putting their cash in a bank. The average salary across the country is $60K. That's not a starting salary. That's just the average salary across the board. The average price of a home is $199,200. If you want to live somewhere nice, it's closer to $300,000 to $400,000. So basically, you can't afford to buy. You're buying at the top of the market. Sure, your interest rates are low, but if you do buy, you're now trapped in a house because if you do an interest rate or an adjustable rate and the mortgage market and the stock market crashes and values go down, your $600,000 or your $500,000 little starter home is now worth $400,000. You're underwater paying a mortgage for the next 30 years you can't afford. So people in that generation aren't interested in buying houses, and the ones that are making themselves cash poor and house rich. 55% of people in 2020 live in cities. 40% did in 1980. The inverted yield curve is the first time since 2007 we've had an inverted yield curve, which essentially means the economy is not going to continue to expand. So if you're 23 to 25 and you don't know all that stuff and you just go on gut, you know why you're into crypto? Because it's exciting, because you see people getting rich in your mind, and because you see opportunity, and because it plays to your digitally native nature, which is, why the hell do I need paper? Why do I need a bank? Why do I need any of this? I've got a mobile phone. I live on this thing. It's the remote control of my life. Why do I have to pull out crap to pay? Why do I have to wait to get a wire? Well, I don't want that. I'm 23 to 25. I'm fast. I'm nimble. Oh, by the way, this is the only place that I can see value. This is the only place I can see upside. Everything else is at a peak and I can't reach it anyway. So 10 years from now, you think that's going to change?
No. So Chris, I want to make sure we cover a couple other topics before we run out of time. So let me just summarize real quick, and then and leverage and point and pivot into the next part. So what I'm hearing you say is that government's basically in trouble, such that economic power is shifting from government to cryptocurrency. There are fundamentals which are causing that. Those fundamentals are not going to change, right? Governments have concern about two things, right? Which is maintaining their power and also staying competitive, right? So how should governments respond to this scenario? And then the other thing I want to talk about, pivot into, is tokenomics, right? So you're the founder and executive author of the World Tokenomics Forum. I want to talk a little bit about, we understand the rules in terms of economics, right? We understand monetary policy, and that's all been based on rules and systems that have been around for a long time. We understand about the supply of money, but how does that all change when, anytime a new company wants to create a token, or with 9 lines of code, somebody can create a new token? The whole rules about the availability, the distribution, supply of money, how it all works, all those rules change with tokenomics, right? And as a society, how do we get smart, right, about understanding the world from an economic perspective and shifting into trying to understand the world from a tokenomics perspective? So the two questions are, how does government respond to the current situation? And how do we move into the place where people in government can get an appreciation and understanding of tokenomics so that they can help manage their societies?
I would say, first of all, I don't know that all governments are in trouble. I think government is just evolving. The visual I'll give everybody as I answer this question, because it's a multifaceted question and it's a good one, is there is a race right now in a blue ocean. So we've all heard of blue ocean strategy, right? Forget going into the competitive scape. Let's go into the place where nothing's clear and it's just wide open and we can all create. So if we think we're in a blue ocean right now, which I'd encourage everybody to try on, then imagine a race that has begun. Willingly or unwillingly, all the participants in this race fall into a couple of categories. One is huge, big old barges protected by huge, big old aircraft carriers, right? Which means if they hit something, it's over for whatever they hit. They move very large and they create a huge wake, and they're floating cities, right? But they can't turn on a dime. Got it? That's governments. In the same ocean, in the same race, you have these private, corporate, state battleships and cruisers that are faster. They can turn a little faster, but they command a lot of people too, and they're weaponized. And then you have cigarette boats. These are people that are really freaking smart. They know every nook and cranny, every millimeter, everything about the ocean, and they just zip and zop and zip and zop, and they just run circles around the battleships and around the cruiser, or around the aircraft carriers. The challenge is they have nowhere to call home. So those are the three. That's the visual I give you, because that's the world today. So what is government's role in this, and how does it need to evolve itself? It needs to understand what it is and what it isn't. It's not a cigarette boat, so it can act like one, right? It's not a battleship. It may own battleships, but it's not a battleship in this race. And the loyalty of those battleships is much like the loyalty of a mercenary army. What you give me will buy you my loyalty. And if you won't give it to me and someone else will, I fight for them. But bottom line is, these are my soldiers, baby. And the battleships have figured out a way to say to the cigarette boats, hey, guess what? You guys want it, we're aligned, right? We're on your side. So we're safe. If you ever need a place to stay, come over here for a minute. Just give us your data. Why I say all that is I'm trying to contextualize the landscape in a way that people maybe can more simply understand the dynamics at play. But to answer your question, let's talk about something that the US government has done right, because I think it's easier to give an example. When we talk about all this potential risk of not only capital flight, but talent flight or geopolitical issues that are way bigger than my pay grade and certainly my ability to speak on, but that have to do with deep level spy type stuff, right? China, US, all these things, right? These are real things that we need government to do because quite frankly, like there's just stuff that none of us understand that only a handful of the people in the world actually do. And we hope that those elected officials make choices that are good, right? Because that's a variable that's just been since humanity's been around and that none of us, can control. And most of us don't even want to know about, quite frankly. It's why we live in a safe place where the sun comes up every morning, because people are willing to deal with that crap day in and day out. So forget that for a minute. The piece that I would center us back on is let's talk about legislation that we did right, but that we're not thinking about in the right way as it relates to what could the U.S. do specifically and what could other countries learn from it. What the U.S. did in the 2017 Tax and Jobs Recovery Act legislation was he created a piece of legislation called opportunity zones. And opportunity zones is an asset class of its own, in my opinion. What it essentially said was federal law said, hey, if you have capital gains tax, which mostly only people in the investment class have, but if you have capital gains tax and you are willing to reinvest that into what we call a qualified opportunity zone, which they handed out to the states and everything, hey, you go select them. So 8,700 different tracts of land across the entire 50 states and its territories, which includes Guam, Puerto Rico, and all those, are now designated opportunity zones. There's tracts of land that are essentially considered a zone, right? So if you put a business or an investment into a qualified opportunity zone, you get certain benefits. One of those things are you don't pay the capital gains tax that you would owe in that year for a period of 7 years. And at the 5-year point, if you have left that money in that investment or in a qualified opportunity zone fund that is making multiple investments and cycling your money, keeping it in qualified opportunity zones, you get a 10% discount on the initial tax bill. So in other words, let's say you have $1 million worth of capital gains this year. I would owe just to the feds roughly $238,000 of that in tax this year. If I took that million and I put it into an investment that was a qualified opportunity zone, I don't pay that $238 this year. And when it's due in 2026, I'm not paying it on $1 million. I'm paying it on $900,000. If I've waited 5 years. If I wait 7 years, I'm paying it on $850,000. Well, why that matters is now the tax due on my original $1 million gain, instead of being $238, is $200, and I had 7 years before I had to pay it, which meant that I could compound 5, 6, 7, 8, 10% a year, whatever kind of return I could get. I could compound my million fully for the next 7 years before I owed on the original discounted tax. And why that matters is there's $6 trillion roughly that they identified as sitting on the sideline in unrealized capital gains, meaning the Apple stock you just won't sell because you don't want to pay the tax on it and you don't know where else to put it. There's $6.1 trillion estimated today in this country alone sitting on the sidelines because they don't have an incentive to cash it out and they don't want to pay the tax and they have to put it somewhere else, right? That's the problem of making money, is then you got to find another place to invest it. And right now, with everything in a bubble, that's become hard. So why this is good legislation is it was intended to democratize economic development, democratize investment, and provide a really interesting incentive to people with capital gains to invest in somewhere that isn't Silicon Valley, New York, or whatever. Not that there aren't opportunity zones in Silicon Valley too, but the idea was you could invest anywhere in the 50 states or its territories that you wanted to, and you could get a big tax incentive for doing it, and you could get a compounded gain that was tax-free if you left it in for 10 years. So if you turned $1 million into $100 million over the next 10 years and you never took it out, at 10-year and day one, that $99 million gain is tax-free for life. So that was a huge incentive. And that law's been on the books, and it was clarified further. The regulation around that got really clear, 95% of the way anyway, April 17th of 2019. So now it's very clear on what it means, what you can invest in as it relates to real estate or a business, what the safe harbors are, how you have to qualify it. And it's pretty straightforward. It's a really good piece of legislation. Why did that matter? Because in 2017, with no regulation and no foresight around what crypto was and who was responsible for it, CFTC, SEC, which governing body was going to regulate it and all that stuff, everyone that had an idea in there was taking their stuff offshore. and starting to build relationships in other markets, which was good for the rest of the world in one way, but tiring and expensive for the entrepreneur and bad for the United States. With opportunity zones and with clarity, now I understand, well, hey, if I'm building a technology company, I could build it here and I could get investment. I could unlock capital, which is always the entrepreneur's pain. How do I get capital, right? I can't get it from a bank, and VCs are, too top down and only interested in certain markets. Well, now I've got potentially $6 trillion worth of people I could go talk to. Now, the estimate is that $100 billion will move into the asset class of opportunity zone funds in this year, which is still a lot of money. And so now you've created what I call the incentive piece of tokenomics. Tokens are just a container, right? That's all a token is. So it's a container for something that represents a physical thing, right? Or a digital thing. But it's the container that holds the asset and secures it and provides you a way to trade and move that asset without actually physically moving it or giving up the underlying identity. So PCI compliance was invented in the credit card space. That was a form of tokenization that we're all familiar with because our credit card number actually is linked to our identity, but is not our identity. And it allows us to transact. So this has been around forever, tokenization. Tokenomics is where you're creating circular economies that have a shared incentive chain that creates capital flows. And where this is an opportunity for governments and for everybody is that we all are trying to solve, all the monetary leaders, all the government leaders are trying to solve one problem. How do I continue to create economic growth while I deleverage the monetary supply? And the problem is that's a very tough balancing act, which is why we're having the argument over, do we raise Fed funds rate or lower it next cycle? And because what happens is, as soon as you start to tighten, then you're creating a future where you're indicating that economic growth is going to slow. And so investment moves in different directions and in different assets that are hedged against a slower economic period. So then you have to flood the supply of money back into the system to stimulate it again. So the problem is we're at this critical mass now of stimulus and contraction that is becoming a risk for stagflation, if nothing else, where we can't get economic growth, and yet we have to continue to print money to just maintain. That is the worst of all scenarios. What tokenomics does, and what something like opportunity zone law with a clear regulatory open innovation framework that is controlled, but also not putting old 1930s law to constrain innovators and try and create a top-down control mechanism that isn't going to work when you have people's money now out of the bag to a 23 to 25-year-old set that's going to want it in any form and willing to move wherever they can get it, right? The answer is to take some of these good pieces of legislation and start to evangelize economic growth and opportunity in markets where you can actually use, whether it's a cryptocurrency, whether it's some form of economic system, to create a circular economy. And that's what companies are doing. That's what startups are doing. And what governments can do is experiment with them.
Chris, this is absolutely fascinating. So we got time. I want to unwrap that last comment just a tiny bit. Then I want to let people know how they can get in touch with you and how they can, if they're interested in the topic of tokenomics, how they can connect with you and GBA to do that. But let's circle back to the last thing you just said, right? Which is, cities, states, counties, departments, right? Can you give some examples of how public entities could use tokenomics, and even potentially how they might be able to reach you if they need advice or guidance on how to do that, how they could reach you to
the
explore
easiest way to
topics.
reach me is you pick your favorite. I'm on LinkedIn, Chris J. Snook. You can go to chrisjsnook.com, which is my website, and just contact me there, or you can email me at chris@sandcastleseries.org. Those are the three easiest ways to get in touch with me on this topic. Any and all work.
And we'll also put all that information in the show notes as well, so that people can do an easy click to it. But so how can governments and public entities use tokenomics to accomplish their organizational
I think again,
goals?
instead of using tokenomics, I would say maybe again, tokenomics, my version of tokenomics is it's just the next version of a market economy, right? It is this idea that everything has already been made digital. We used to buy CDs. We used to buy records. We still do as niche things, but the point is music used to be a physical thing, right? I used to buy it. It was a physical asset. It could get scratched and damaged and I'd have to replace it. Now music is like running water or electricity. It's always on, and all we have to do is tap into the API that feeds it into our stream. And so everything that is physical has a digital, or will have a digital and probably smart component or version of itself. And so a token economy, or tokenomics, is the global economy where we arbitrage bits and atoms, and everything physical is represented in a digital equivalent. That's all a token economy is. It's driven by what are the incentive. Every economy has incentives, and it has a circular flow of its currency, and it could be multiple different currencies. So let's not worry about whether it's one currency or multiple. The reality is it's money flows and currencies flow, and they go in a circle from my pocket to your pocket and back to the coffee shop and back to mine and right? So none of that changes. That still happens. It's just, what is the form and medium of exchange we're using in the marketplace? And what's the interface between cryptos and fiat by decrees? We think of cash and the elimination of cash, and it's not about whether cash is good or bad. It's the fact that we think of physical cash as currency, but the majority is 97% of all US dollars aren't actually in physical cash. They are just ones and zeros on a board. So we already have crypto. We already have digital currency. We've had it forever, right? What we're really not talking about here is cryptocurrencies versus fiat currencies. What we're talking about is people's money, free money, sound money in a digital age versus unsound money, fiat by decree, always going to go to zero at some point, that has commandeered the only sound money that humans have ever had, which is gold and silver, to a point at which there's always going to be power left in the hands of governments because they own all the gold and silver, which is a form of sound money. The real question is at what level of scale will digital sound money, i.e. Bitcoin, the most secure form of wealth ever created by the hash rate, forget what the volatility of the price is. You have stability in the system. The system of Bitcoin is, and Caitlin Long wrote a great piece on this in Forbes for those who want to Google it. Just look at currency stability versus systemic stability. Caitlin Long, you'll probably find it. Bitcoin as a network has the most secure stability of storage of wealth of anything that's ever existed in humanity. The hash rate is at all-time highs. We don't have anything like it. The volatility of that price is a different story because currencies operate by different things. But I digress. What can governments do at the local level? What they can do is they can understand that they actually have a raw material that's super valuable and super local and super in their control. And what do you think that raw material is, Gerard? Take a stab at it. Okay, but that's an input that creates the raw material. Who drives economic activity? And what do people actually? What are we actually in today's digital world? What are we actually forms of?
We're content creators.
Yeah, and so I'm going to fast forward because I know we're at the end of the time. You're going down the right path, but I wanted to have you answer this a little bit so you could internalize it. We are forms of data exhaust. Right now, today, I don't know what it is. Cisco did a report that in 2018, data exhaust, which is the amount of data that human beings, think of exhaust, give off, that is nothing is done with it. It's the metadata, it's all forms. Nothing is done with it. It's not mined into activity. So big data, but like the waste. Just think of waste. So just going about our day in 2018, according to Cisco, 400 zettabytes, which is 400 trillion gigabytes worth of data, was the amount of data exhaust. To put that into context, that means 10 gigabytes of data every 10 minutes for every one of the 7.7 billion people on the planet is thrown off. Now, that's not getting smaller. I don't know what it'll be this year. It'll probably be double. What's the point? The point is that when we think about things that have given countries power, gold, silver being one of them, and their reserves, energy, oil under the ground and above it, giving another source of power, right? What's the newest, years ago, someone came out and said data is the new oil. But the local governments, what they can do to understand and to get involved and to enable the innovators in their market, one of the simplest things they can do is what Colorado did years ago, create an open data platform. So if you go to, I think it's just opendata.colorado.gov, I can't remember, but if you look up Open Data Colorado, back in like 2013 or 2012, somewhere back in there, they were the first state in the country that said every data set that we have, we are going to create open APIs for, meaning you can license them, you can work with them, you can manipulate them. So as we collect this data on everything from crime rates to people who got a gun license to people that paid a traffic fine to whatever, right? We've got all this anonymized data that we collect. We're going to open up these data sets to anyone that wants to do stuff with them. And they launched it. Their Secretary of State launched a challenge called Go Code Colorado. I was part of it in the first year and the second year as a mentor and as a judge. And what they did was they put out a challenge and said, hey, we're going to go to the business community. And one of the years I can remember specifically, one of the themes, they went out and they talked to all the small business owners in different regions across the state. So for those who are familiar with Colorado, you've got, the ski towns off of I-70. You've got the Front Range, which is Denver, Colorado Springs, Denver, Boulder, up to Fort Collins. And then you've got, the Western Slope, which is Telluride and Durango and all those. So they went all around and they said, look, we're going to do 5 little regional things. And then we're going to take the best teams, I think it was 2, from each of these 5 regions, and we're going to have them compete for a contract. And I think 25 grand was the prize or something like that for the first place. And essentially what we want you to do is we want you to find a way to take our open data sets and create a technology solution. Could be an app, could be anything, basically a hackathon that could solve problems that our community is facing. So one of the problems that they came up with was people that had businesses, hotels, restaurants, whatever, along I-70 suffered when everything from weather to just traffic flows during ski season caused bogs on I-70. So the answer was, well, we can't widen I-70. In other words, we can't add 5 more lanes because that infrastructure cost to do that is crippling and unattainable, right? Can't do it. But how could we solve traffic on the I-70 with technology? What could we do? They didn't know the answer. So they threw that answer into a state-sponsored challenge with prize money and with contracts to go develop further. They enrolled the VC and the entrepreneurial communities in supporting it. So now VCs could see stuff. And they said, here's the raw material to work with. In other words, here's all our 63 data sets. Here's the themes that business owners and that we care about because it drives our economy. There's 6 of them. You can pick which theme you want, put a team together. It's free to compete. And we're going to give you all the raw material that we have you don't have. That's genius.
Yeah, yeah, that's excellent. And to that point, I just want to let our listeners know, GBA working groups are working with governments around the country and around the world to do things like that. So, for example, one of our working groups is focusing on helping governments, state, local, national governments accept cryptocurrency as tax payments, eventually moving them into smart contracts, and then using that technology to do the budget appropriations and tracking to increase transparency and improve the systems. We've got our Miami chapter is working with the Port Authority, the airports, the rail and the trucking companies to create an open platform for supply chain out of Southern Florida, right? So if anybody's interested in projects like this, by all means, go to the GBA website. At the bottom of the website, hit the contact form. Let us know what you're interested in. We have over 50 working groups working on different projects similar to these. Because Chris, you're exactly right. I mean, getting people access to the data sets at the local municipalities and state and even national and global levels, the things that governments will be able to do will be incredible. Now, to get more information, right, on tokenomics, blockchain, the intersection of government and blockchain, please feel, if you have any questions about that, please let us know, again, at the contact form at the bottom of the website. If you're interested in training, certification, and events, we have a symposium September 14th and 15th in the Washington, D.C. area called The Future of Money Governance and the Law. And we also have certification courses on blockchain, financial, legal, healthcare, technical, and there's one other that we'd be happy to help folks continue their education. And then Chris, again, we'll have them be able to reach out to you directly. If you want to reach out to Chris and you can't any other way, fill out the contact form. We'll make sure he gets the message. But Chris, this has been incredibly informative. I learned so much listening to you speak, and the whole subject of how the whole economic world is shifting to a tokenomic world, and your leadership in your organizations and through all the stuff that you're doing, your vast amount of knowledge. It's just really inspiring. And so I just want to thank you for being on the podcast today. And I hope we get to spend many, many more times in the future.
Well, my pleasure. And I know that the work you're doing with GBA is important, because we can throw government under the bus all we want. We can throw our current duopoly and all the things that are not sustainable or unhealthy about it under the bus all we want. But we have to find a way to take action that is positive. And I support what you're doing and the fight you're fighting to inform, educate, and collect and build community around government leaders and their constituents and innovators in a platform that can have these kind of conversations for the sake of hopefully finding solutions. The thing we say at Sandcastle and World Tokenomic is build bridges, not walls, and the next 100 years starts here. And that's true. And the reality is we share one future. We may come at it from different cultures. We may come at it from different countries. We may come at it from different states, political beliefs, and all that. But humanity shares one future. And we have the chance to be part of defining it. It will be defined for us whether we take action or not. If I stop, it's still going to happen. If you stop, it's still going to happen. But if we can realize that right now, from wherever we are, we can have an imprint on it. And if we can be informed at the different variables, and we have one future and a better future for all of us in mind, then this is the window that we can actually do something about it. And that would inspire and excite anybody that's got a pulse and a little bit of ambition.
Well, and our tagline is we bring government and the private sector together to connect, communicate, and collaborate. And it's all about solving problems and making a better future. So, while we come at this thing from vastly different perspectives, I think we have the same aim. So, listen, with that, thank you very much. I'm gonna end out the podcast, and Chris, I'll talk to you sometime real soon. The Future of Money Governance and the Law is brought to you by the Government Blockchain Association, or GBA. The podcast brings together leaders in the public and private sector to discuss how government and industry can work together. We talk about how to enhance the integrity of our institutions and the quality of life for the people they serve.